Good morning, everyone. Perek Aleph, Mishna Yud. Now, until now, we were talking about situations where you had processed oil and unprocessed olives. And unprocessed olives meant that they were olives waiting to be pressed. You started crushing them to be pressed. But we're talking about when we call them unprocessed, they're unprocessed in the sense that there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still what to be done here, just in doing what you're planning on doing with these olives or grapes. But we also know that there is a halacha when it comes to the obligation of truma taking effect into produce, is that you need gamar malachta, the completion of the process. The completion of the process, for instance, when it comes to grain, is that after you've threshed it, you pile it up and you smooth out the top. So even after you've threshed it and you've gone through the bulk of the physical processing, you only have left to, let's say, pile it, or you may have piled it, but you didn't smooth it yet, and that's the only thing left to be done. That is called lo nigmar malachtan. Their processing has not been completed, meaning completed to the very end of completion. So until now, we're talking about at a very early point of not being processed. And today's Mishna is really going to talk about a situation where you're past that stage. You're past that stage of a lot of involvement, a lot of effort, or a lot more work to do, or let's call it a significant amount of work left to do in order to process this. You're holding at a point that, call it a physical point, it's been processed, but you just haven't put on the final touch, so that halacha recognizes that the truma obligation has fully taken effect on this grain. So the Mishna says like this: Ein tarmin midavar shnigmar malachtai. You may not take truma from something that has been completely processed. Completely processed means it has been processed to the final point, where now the obligation of truma on this produce takes full effect. Al davar shnigmar malachtai. You can't take truma from that completely processed produce for something that has not yet been completely processed. You have grain that you already piled up and smoothed on top, and you have grain that you probably didn't smooth it yet. So that's the grain that hasn't been smoothed yet is called loy nigmar malachtan. The processing is not yet complete, which means that the obligation for truma has not fully taken effect into this grain. So the Mishna says you cannot take off truma from the completely processed grain for the not completely processed grain. You can't do that. Nor can you take off truma from something that was not completely processed for something that is completely processed. You can't separate from the pile that hasn't been smoothed out for the pile that has been smoothed out. Nor can you separate from something that was not completely processed for something that's also not completely processed. Two piles that have been smoothed out, even though they're the same, you're not allowed to take from the unprocessed, from the uncompletely processed for the other uncompletely processed. And it comes from the same verse in the Torah that we learned about the stage before, about the unprocessed grain or grapes or olives. It's the same source, but it's a different stage. One is a stage where it's not processed. I think that's the way to say it. It's not processed. While here we're talking about that we can call it processed, but not completely processed. Either way, the Torah forbids any of these situations of taking truma one for the other. You can't take truma from something that is not completely processed for something else, or same thing before when it was unprocessed before. However, when it comes to this stage of the game, where we say the imtarmu trumas and truma, but when it comes to this stage of the game, when we're where we're talking about the not completely processed and the completely processed, the imtarmu, the Mishna says, if you did separate truma in any of these cases from the not completely processed to the completely, or from the completely processed to the not completely processed, or from the not completely processed to the other not completely processed, were you to take trumas and truma, the truma stands. It's a good truma. Until now, the previous case that we spoke about, in all those cases, we're talking about actually, midaraisa, we said that in all the other cases before about the unprocessed, we said midaraisa from the Torah point, it works. It's just that in one case, when you did the unprocessed for the processed, the Chachamim said, completely took away its status as truma, because you're giving to the Kohen something unprocessed like olives. He still has a lot more work to do when it comes to getting the olive oil out, which is the primary purpose of olives. The Chachamim said you shouldn't be giving truma like that to the Kohen, where he has so much effort he has to do, and they completely nullified the truma. Then we have the case where you separated from the oil for the unprocessed, where we said again, the truma you took from the oil is a truma, but you got to take a second one from the unprocessed. We spoke about yesterday. That's because of the fact that we say that the sages were afraid if we allow you to basically not eat from this unprocessed, you may go ahead and do the other way around also. When we went from the unprocessed for the oil, you may also come to take from the oil. So the Chachamim said we're not making any differentiations, and we're not going to say the truma is not a good truma, but you're going to have to take a second truma. But in this case, we don't have that situation when it's just a question of complete processing or not. The complete processing or not, again, is going to be a situation where there is no huge involvement for the Kohen with whatever he would land up with. It's just a question of processing, completing the process, smoothing it out, or whatever has to be done. When in the Masechta, the tractate Masris, it talks about more in detail different things, what's considered their different types of produce, what's considered their completion, what's considered their complete processing. But nonetheless, the explanation would be that at this point in time, what you're giving to the Kohen isn't such a big deal for him to finish up, and therefore all the concerns that we had before wouldn't be relevant. The point is just that, or more than just that. The point is that, according to many opinions, it's the Torah that forbids from separating from not completely processed, completely processed, and therefore you're not allowed to do it. But if you did it, it still works. Now, Sefer HaMitzvot. Okay, this is going to be a little bit of a longer one today. One is not allowed to tell someone what someone else said about him. Okay, Reuven and Shimon and Levi. Levi heard Reuven say something about Shimon, and Levi goes to Shimon and says, "This is what Reuven said about you, or this is what Reuven did to you." That is what we call it tale bearing. Basically telling someone what someone else did about them. And that is prohibited to do. You shall not go around like a peddler, like a talebearer, like a peddler who peddles articles from one place to the other. Don't be a peddler of tales of stories from one person to the other, when what you're doing is you're letting someone know what someone else said negatively or did negatively to them, or something that they would take as negative. Although you're telling the truth, this is prohibited and it destroys the world. This is a very great sin. And it could actually cause thousands of people to be killed, as we find by the story of Doeg HaAdomi. When King David was running away from Shalom, from King Saul, so he was taken in by the city called Nov. It was a city of Kohanim. And a man named Doeg HaAdomi told Shaul that the city of Nov gave refuge to David. Shaul went and killed out the whole city. So you see, from that's an example, that's a precedent that shows how dangerous it can be when you do this. This is what we call rechilas. That's rechilas, telling someone what someone else did against them. There's another very great sin, even greater than this. It's also included in this prohibition, which is what we call lashon hara, gossip, slander, evil talk. This is someone who speaks disparagingly about someone, even though he's saying the truth. That is prohibited. That's called lashon hara. That is included in the prohibition, although the prohibition talks about rochel, which really in its basic interpretation means telling what one person did against another, but telling a person what someone else did against him. Here, you're just speaking disparagingly about the person, and although it's the truth, it's forbidden. But if what you're saying is a lie, Nikra Maitzi Shemra. Then you're already called someone who is spreading a bad report, which is of course worse. The Lashon Hara who, and when we say this phrase Lashon Hara, ha'omer, that means kach v'kach oisa ploini. He said, this is what so and so did. Kach v'kach oisa. So and so, you know what his fathers were like. V'kach shamati love. This is why I heard about him. V'omer d'var mishal gnai, and he is speaking disparagingly about the person. Al za'amar hakasev, regarding this person, this pasuk states, Yachras Hashem kosiv seich halakas lashon medaberes kadolos. Hashem should cut off all the smooth lips, all the cunning lips, the tongue that speaks proud things, great things, but meaning things that are that have strong repercussions against someone. Ramru Chazal, and our sages say, there are three sins that a person will receive punishment in them in this world and also lose his portion in the world to come. If a person commits idol worship, immorality, murder, Lashon Hara keneged kulam. Speaking of Lashon Hara is equal to them all. Chazal, our sages also stated, Hamasapa Lashon Hara, one who speaks Lashon Hara, ki'ilu kafar be'ikar, is like someone who is denying the main principle, meaning it's as if you're denying the existence of God. Another statement from our sages in the Medrash, that Lashon Hara kills three people: Ha'imrei, the one who says it; V'mekabli, the one who accepts it; V'nemar alav, the one who is spoken about. V'mekabli, when it comes to the person who accepts it, Yosim Ha'imrei, he's even worse than the person who has spoken about it, because basically he has allowed this to come about. If he wouldn't have listened, he wouldn't have had what to say, and the other person would have been spoken disparagingly about. Then you have certain things that constitute avak, a dust, a shade of Lashon Hara. For instance, if a person were to say, who would have ever thought so-and-so would have turned out like this? You didn't say anything wrong, but you certainly were implying something. You say, don't talk to me about so-and-so. And any rate, I don't want to talk about what happened with him. So again, you're not talking specifically about what's wrong, but you're clearly implying that there is something wrong. If you talk about someone you talk about Reuben in front of Shimon, you know that Shimon does not like Reuben, and you start praising Reuben in front of Shimon. That's considered also a shade of Lashon Hara. Because you know what's going to happen from that? When you speak in front of Shimon how great Reuben is, Shimon's going to start talking about how bad Reuben is. That means you brought about speaking Lashon Hara. If you jokingly speak Lashon Hara, you didn't mean to hurt the person, just a joke. That's also Lashon Hara. So to a person who speaks in a cunning way, as if he doesn't know that what he's saying is Lashon Hara. You make a comment, I said something wrong about him. That also is Lashon Hara. The prohibition of Lashon Hara is whether you say it in front of the person's face, the person you're speaking disparagingly about. Whether you say it in front of him or behind his back, it's Lashon Hara. And now a rule, what constitutes Lashon Hara? What's considered bad speech? Anyone who says things that could cause, if they would now spread from one person to another to the person you spoke about, and it would cause to cause the person physical damage, or monetary damage, or even if it just causes him even if it's just distress or fear. All these types of things that you say, even if the person doesn't hear about it, or even if the person never hears about it, but this is what constitutes Lashon Hara, saying something about someone that if he'd hear about it, it would upset him, or possibly hurt him even worse. It's not necessary to talk about a person who informs another person in front of a government official. Because of that, the government takes away his money. It's as if he's killing the person and the person's family who depend on him. He now falls under the category of being an informer. And on that, our sages say Gehenna ends and doesn't end for him. That's already a person who goes so far as Lashon Hara so far is to actually go and inform upon him to the government to get him. That's an even worse form of Lashon Hara, because by handing this over, informing upon this person to the government, by doing so, you're causing him to lose everything. This applies in all places at all times, both by men and by women. Of course, everything we spoke about today, there's a lot of detail to it. I'm sure there's a lot of questions, a lot to discuss about it, but these are, so to speak, the general outline, the general parameters of Lashon Hara and Rechilus. Have a wonderful day.